Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a look at this thing right here, which is the ASUS RS700-E10-RS12U. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, wait a sec, does that product name have RS in it twice? The answer to that is actually yes. I kind of wish that ASUS got a little bit more creative or something like that with their model names. It seems like having two RSs is a little superfluous, but that's what we have in this particular model. Now, this server is a 1U dual Intel Xeon scalable, so 3rd gen Intel Xeon scalable Ice Lake server. And that means that we get a lot of new features in this generation that we didn't necessarily get in previous generations. And beyond just the CPUs themselves, though, there's a whole lot of other technology and different features that are really different in this generation versus previous generation of dual Xeon servers. And so my thought was, well, why don't we start at the front of the server and kind of work our way back to the rear of the server and just kind of talk through some of those differences and some of the key features. Now, a couple key housekeeping notes. Actually, we're going to have two this video. The first one is the fact that ASUS did send us this server, and they did help configure, like, get CPUs and stuff like that with the server because, well, frankly, we just are running out of Ice Lake generation processors, and they're really tight at this point. And so that's a big help. And so we're going to mark this video as sponsored, just so you guys know. And then the second one, which is actually kind of a little bit more personal, is just the fact that this is going to be the last video that is going to be recorded in the Blue Door studio. We've been using this set with the Blue Doors for over a year since the pandemic really started. And so this is actually the last video that will be recorded in this studio before it gets moved to its new location. And most likely the Blue Doors are going to be going away. Now, this may not be the last video on the channel that actually features the Blue Doors because, of course, we record things and they don't necessarily get published in the same order that they get recorded. But I might actually go do a little video where we go around and, show you the studio because it's absolutely awesome and it's been phenomenal. So that's a little STH update, but let's get back to the server. So looking at the front of the server, the first thing that you're going to notice is that there are 12 2.5-inch drive bays. Now, for a long time, you've been able to go and get 24 bay 2U servers, and that's been very popular for a really long time. But in the 1U form factor, you'd only been able to get 10 drives, which means that you basically lose 20% of your storage, or you got 20% more storage by going to a 2U server versus having the 1U form factor. By being able to fit 12 drives in a 1U server, that kind of advantage really goes away. In this particular server, because we have the Ice Lake generation processors, which we'll talk about a little bit later, we get PCIe Gen 4, which is an upgrade over PCIe Gen 3 in the previous generation. And we also get all of these drives are actually NVMe drives. So we don't have to have SATA drives and we don't have to have SAS drives, lower performance interfaces. We can use PCIe Gen 4 NVMe SSDs. And we've done a number of reviews about the PCIe Gen 4 NVMe SSDs on STH on the main site. I think we've had a couple of reviews also on our YouTube channel. One little tiny feature that I don't think we get any B-roll of, but just on the service tag, we didn't get a unique password labeled on there, and we didn't actually see that on the rear of the chassis either. I think that's one thing that ASUS really could, I guess improve upon, which is just having that nice little label that says, like, here's what the password is and here's what the MAC addresses for the system and all that kind of stuff. You tend to see that on other servers, and it would just be kind of nice if that was just standard on these servers as well. So all of the cables that you see in the front of the system are really driving those NVMe drives on the front. We also don't get things like USB ports or VGA ports or anything like that because this is a very tight 1U system. We don't have a lot of extra room. So one other thing that we don't get with this kind of really dense configuration is that the way that they're able to get 12 drives up there is that they actually don't have any sides on the hot swap trays. And what that practically means is that you do have to screw your 2.5-inch drives into these. We're seeing a lot of the, especially like the 1U 10 bay servers these days are really utilizing toolless drive trays. But just because, we have this really dense configuration with 12 drives, we don't get that toolless anymore. There are plenty of folks that are more than happy to give up that toolless to get 20% more density, but that's just a trade-off that has to be made. I will note right here that this is the 2.5-inch version of the chassis. There are options, and there's an option for, I guess, 4 3.5-inch bays if you'd rather have that. There are options for that in the server. And behind the drives, what you really get is a whole bunch of these cables. The cables carry the PCIe and NVMe traffic between the motherboard and the drives. But then the big thing I want to focus on is really the fan partition. This is definitely something that's a little bit different in the server versus some of the other servers that we look at. There are a total of 9 fans, and the 9 fans are single fan units. They're not, counter rotating units or anything like that. And so it's a relatively simple setup, actually. A small detail that I think is really kind of fun is that, in 1U servers, it's actually probably less common that you see hot swap fans just because there's just not enough room for the connectors and what have you. But what you have in the server is actually these 2 little PCBs, and these PCBs actually have all the fan power and, really the fan headers. And that makes servicing these fans actually super quick and super easy to go do because you just have a 4-pin PWM power connector, and the cables are actually really short. And so it's really easy to figure out, which header goes to which fan. So actually, this is a pretty nice solution. I was pretty surprised at that. Something that is also kind of fun is that just next to the PWM fan connectors, there's actually 6-pin kind of hot swap connectors that are, sitting right next to that. So there obviously is the capability to go do hot swap. It's really hard to design a hot swap carrier for 1U. The vast majority of 1U servers just don't have hot swap fans for that reason. Okay, so looking at the middle section of this, we get really kind of maybe the biggest change by far in this generation. We get 2 Intel Xeon scalable processors, and you'll see that we have some just giant heat sinks here. And the reason that we have these heat sinks that are not just the center section like we'd seen in previous generations, but something that we're seeing more in this generation is we kind of see these extra little heat pipes that go off to extra heat sinks that provide more cooling to the chips, is just the fact that, well, that's different in this generation because we can now support up to 270 watt processors, which means that this can practically support a Intel Xeon Platinum 8380, which is a 270 watt processor. That's up from 205 watts for the 8280 in the previous gen. So because we are actually adding 65 watts of TDP, we need more cooling, and that's why we have these kind of more elaborate cooling schemes. Something that was at least visually striking to me, and just because we do so many of these reviews and these server reviews, is just the fact that this heatsink design is a little bit different. What I mean by that is that the heat pipes are actually a little bit longer than we typically see in other servers. Oftentimes, if a heatsink does extend, using heat pipes and has the auxiliary heat sinks on it, you'll see that those are placed just after the DIMMs in terms of airflow. This is kind of the opposite though. Those heat pipes are actually elongated, so it doesn't just clear the DIMMs, but it goes all the way to the front part of the motherboard, right up to the fans. And so those auxiliary heat sinks are actually cooled by the fans, and then that heated air actually cools the RAM. Now, typically, RAM does not really use that much airflow, or doesn't have that high of airflow requirements or power requirements compared to CPUs, and especially when you kind of take into account the surface area and stuff. But at the same time, it is just kind of interesting that this is a little bit different than what we've seen in some of the other servers that we've looked at. Along with the higher TDP, we also get higher core counts. So in this generation, with that Platinum 82 or 8380, we actually get up to 40 cores, where the 8280 was only a 28 core part. So that's an increase of 12 cores from 28 up to 40 in this generation. We have a video going into all the Ice Lake features, but the 2 important ones that I also want to just point out really quickly here are the fact that we go and we now have 8-channel DDR4 3200 support. So not only do we have the higher frequency, but we also have 8-channel support per CPU. We can do 2 DIMMs per channel in this system, which means that we get a full set of 16 DIMMs per CPU and 32 for the entire server. And just because we have all 32 DIMMs available in this platform, which is the maximum for the Ice Lake generation, that also means that we can support not just DRAM, but we can also use the new Optane PMEM200 series. We have an entire video going into what all this whole Optane persistent memory and the Optane DIMMs is all about. So we're going to go link that in the description as well. But the big thing here is that we can get high capacity, we get more memory bandwidth, and we also have the ability to go have things like persistent storage if we want to do that in this server. And it's kind of cool that not only can we support 270 watt CPUs, but we can also support DC PMEM 200 or PMEM 200. But just a quick note there, you probably do want to go and just double check that the CPU that you pick can actually support Optane, because not all Intel Xeon Ice Lake processors can support Optane. But just behind the processors and the memory, we really start to talk about that next feature, which I think is really important, which is PCIe Gen 4. Now, we talked about the PCIe Gen 4 NVMe drives, but we also get PCIe Gen 4 expansion in the back of the system. Each Intel Xeon processor gets not only PCIe Gen 4, but also gets 64 lanes of PCIe Gen 4, which means that we get more lanes than we got in the previous generation of Intel Xeon scalable processors. And what that practically means in this server is the fact that we can use 48 lanes for the NVMe, but still have plenty of lanes left over for the rear I/O. Now, this is another area where this server gets a couple of different options. So I'm going to talk about those as we kind of go through this. But the first big one, and you're probably going to see this right away, is sitting right here, which is the fact that we have an NVIDIA A100. Now, we are running an NVIDIA A100 series on STH this month. And so we have an NVIDIA A100 GPU in this server. Now, this particular riser card slot has basically two options. You can either have two PCIe slots here, and then you don't necessarily, you're not going to put a GPU in that, but you can put two PCIe add-in cards, which is kind of awesome for a lot of configurations. Now, since we do have a GPU that does use a lot of power, we actually need more cooling through this part of the chassis, which is why we have two auxiliary fans in the back of the system. So this extra fan module, in case you're wondering, is only something that you would use if you have a GPU. If you're going to put something like NICs, you probably would have dual slots here, and then you'd not want to have the fans because you may have cables like optical cables or DACs or something like that you'd want to hang off of those NICs, and so having the fans would be just in the way. And so that's why we do actually have the fans for the GPU, but you probably wouldn't have it if you didn't have the GPU. You also don't necessarily need that much cooling if you're not going to have something like a 250 watt GPU sitting here. The other riser is another PCIe slot. In this particular unit, we have a Mellanox, which is now NVIDIA, 25 gig Ethernet card. And so you get a low profile slot. And if you want to go put a NIC, that's probably the one that you're going to use most likely for the NIC. But there actually is one more PCIe slot, even though you may not think that there are, because if you look at the back, it doesn't look like there are actually extra PCIe slots, but there is one. And it actually sits right here along the riser that has the A100, but on the other side of it. So we actually have a by 8 internal PCIe slot. And you might wonder, well, what is that for? Why would I want something like that? Well, a really good example of where you'd want an internal slot and where these things are pretty popular is putting things like a SAS controller or HBA. So if you have a RAID controller, HBA, something like that, you may want to have an internal card, because what you're going to do is you're going to route your cables from the RAID controller or HBA through the front of the chassis and then to your drive bays. For this server, you'd most likely use a PIC card, but we didn't have that in our configuration to show you. Before we get to the rear of the system, one thing that I do want to point out is just the fact that there are two M.2 slots that actually sit just in front of the power supplies right here. And that may not seem obvious if you're just kind of looking at the server and not taking a really kind of close look, because you have black M.2 slots or two black M.2 slots on top of a black motherboard, and it is kind of hard to see because it's not overly contrasty. And there's also a little airflow guide that goes over it. But the kind of cool thing here is that you actually get the fans from the power supplies that pull air over those M.2 slots. So you actually get a decent amount of airflow over your M.2 SSDs. Getting to that rear I/O, the first thing we're going to talk about is the power supplies. Now, in our test system, we have two redundant power supplies. I just pulled one out so you can see. This is actually a 1.6 kilowatt unit, and there's two of them, so that gives you redundancy. This particular unit is an 80 plus platinum unit, but there are also options for 1.6 kilowatt 80 plus titanium units, and you can also go down to 1.2 kilowatts if you want that. Now, we've talked a little bit about some of the rear expansion and the fans and 25 gig Ethernet and all that kind of stuff. But there are a couple things that are different here, and definitely different in this server than you're going to see in the vast majority of other servers on the market. We do have features like the VGA, which we would kind of expect because this does have a baseboard management controller, and we also have USB ports. But there is that other feature there, and you're going to notice that you have a LED screen that shows the BIOS and the postcode. And this is one of those features that I personally didn't really understand the value of the first time I saw it, because most servers frankly don't have a little screen that tells you, what the postcode is or what the status of the system is. And so you kind of look at a server like this, you see it and you're like, I don't really understand why it's so needed. I get it, maybe, I guess on some consumer motherboards, okay, I guess that makes sense, but why do you need it on a server? It turns out actually a couple of years ago in the Intel Xeon E5 2600 V3 generation, we purchased a bunch of ASUS servers that were the 2U 4-node server. So in a 2U chassis, you had 4 different server nodes, each dual socket nodes, and it just kind of gave you really nice density. And we used those things for absolutely years for just kind of loading the data center and what have you. But because we had a bunch of these chassis stacked up in the data center in the rack, it meant that all these little systems were sitting there, and every U had 2 different systems and they all looked exactly the same. And the way that I really found that it was actually kind of useful was we actually had a system that, and in that big array, that like one of them was just not booting, there's a failed component. And so we basically had a different postcode on that than all of the other systems on that, wall of, or that rack of servers. And so it made it really easy to figure out which one, I guess, needed to be serviced. And in those 2U 4-node chassis, you can just kind of pull the system out from the rear. So it's actually super easy with those. And I guess that's just a trademark of all of their servers. Just they, have that, and it's something that they have on their consumer motherboards. They have it on their servers, just kind of a thing. Something that you are going to notice, and this is actually an option that we don't have in the server, is the fact that we don't actually have any onboard networking. So we do have the 2 25 gig Ethernet ports from the expansion slot and the Mellanox card or NVIDIA card, but we don't necessarily have any onboard networking. There are options in this server for quad 1 gig Ethernet or dual 10 gig Ethernet, but we actually don't have those in the system. Part of that area is blocked by the fan assembly. You will see one RJ45 port here, and that is really the ASMB 10 IKVM port. ASMB 10 IKVM is the fancy way to say that this has Megarack SPX, which is just kind of a standard BMC firmware. It's really common if you don't want to get into a proprietary kind of firmware to use SPX. It's something we've seen in a lot of servers. Something that is a little bit different, and it's kind of nice actually in the server, is the fact that this uses the ASPEED AST 2600 BMC, which is just an upgraded version or a kind of newer, faster version of what a lot of servers have used for years, which is the AST 2500 or 2520. And so in this generation of 3rd gen Xeon Scalable Ice Lake servers, there are still some vendors that are still using the AST 2500. So using 2600 just gives you a little bit more performance. It is kind of nice. It boots up a little bit faster. So that means you can get into the APIs or the web interface or something like that. You can get in just a little bit faster because it boots up a little bit faster. It's a good example of how you can actually perceive that sometimes, but a lot of times you don't necessarily need that speed. Okay, I want to cover 3 quick things before we kind of wrap this up, and really just want to talk about performance and some of the things about how this works and what's going on in the server. So in terms of performance, we basically ran our benchmark suite against CPUs, and we did a couple different SKUs. We also did it against the GPU. We've been doing a lot of these A100 systems, so we had some data just from single GPU. And the basic bottom line is the fact that this server was able to cool all the components. And we didn't actually test the failure. So if a fan fails, if you can still maintain that performance. So we didn't get to actually test that. We just didn't have enough time to. But at the same time, if everything's working, it seems like that this is able to cool components at least as well as other servers that we've tested. But I know a lot of our readers and those of you on YouTube are like, hey, this is STH. I know you guys have been looking at things like 8 GPU systems, and this is a single GPU. So what would you use a single A100, like a high-end GPU in a server like this? And I kind of anticipated that was going to be a question. And I guess the really kind of interesting thing that you can do with the A100 that is very different from previous generations is the fact that the A100 has many instance GPU or MIG support. What that practically allows you to do is take this single A100 GPU and partition it into different size of, you kind of think like GPU instances almost. And so you can have something like a 20 gig instance, but you could also have something that's smaller, and you could have like 7 smaller instances on a single A100. Now, different NVIDIA cards have different amounts of MIG instances that they support, but the A100 does support 7. And what it turns out, especially if you get the higher end GPUs, it turns out that the net effect of having MIG in your system is that you can a lot of times simulate having a lot more kind of lower end accelerators. And a really good example that NVIDIA uses a lot, and we've kind of tested this as well, is just the fact that MIG allows you to split up this A100 and get the equivalent of, and a lot of times like for inferencing, the old NVIDIA T4 GPU. So instead of having to have like say 7 or even 4 T4 GPUs in a server like this, you can just have one A100 potentially use less power, but you can also use only one PCIe slot versus multiple PCIe slots, and that allows you to fit more inferencing acceleration into a 1U server like this. Of course, the A100 costs more, but if you don't necessarily need to go put as many servers out there, that kind of really offsets that cost in a big way. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this look at the RS700-E10-RS12U. I have to admit, at the end of this review and the end of filming this video, I am feeling a little bit nostalgic just because this is my last video. This is my last sign off in this studio. But at the same time, we're moving to something that's bigger and better. It's just going to take a couple weeks to get online. So just kind of really excited for that. And if you do want to stay tuned for when we do have that new studio and see all the other great content that we have, why don't you give this video a like, click subscribe, turn on notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.